Hi, my name is Hannah. Welcome back to Savage Reads, and I have had an interesting week of books. I kind of ended up in a bit of a fantasy kick, so that's a little different for me. I'm excited to talk about these books, but first, embroidery update. I'm getting closer. So, trees, done. I added some more branches. Hopefully they look more like trees instead of just floating branches. I am just about done with the grass, but then I'm going to add in the fallen leaves, so won't be quite so harsh of a delineation. And then I've got to do the path, but it's going somewhere. I'm getting close, and I will be done with that one soon. And hopefully I can find some inspiration for the next one. So let's jump into the books that I have read the last week. Now, the first book was recommended by Melinda at A Web of Stories, so make sure to check out her channel. I will link it down below. I picked up Hench by Natalie Zena Wellshot, and this book is in a world of superheroes and supervillains. We have our main character who works for a temp agency that supplies henchmen to supervillains. And after being injured by a superhero in her line of work, she starts to put together how much damage is caused by these superheroes and how many lives are lost because of the superheroes. And she starts making a blog and kind of going out to take down these superheroes who are more of the problem than the supervillains themselves. And I had such a delightful time with this book. It was fun. If you want a book that is fun, and I don't think it ever had a moment of real depth for me that I thought, wow, that changed my life, but it didn't need to. It was fun. It was a good time. I enjoyed it. I thought the characters were really interesting. It would be so easy with this plot to say, okay, so the superheroes are actually the bad ones and the supervillains are actually the good ones and they're going to take them down. And I think it had a little bit more nuance than that. These supervillains still aren't doing great things. They still are very morally not acceptable, but the alternative isn't that great either, and you have to kind of work within those dimensions. And so I thought this was a great time. I had a good time. I felt satisfied by where things ended up. I just was happy with this book. I had fun. If you want some fun escapism, this one was great. Now, speaking of fun escapism, a couple weeks ago, I had read the first book in the Shades of Magic trilogy, and it was called A Darker Shade of Magic by Victoria E. Schwab. And so this week, I went through the second and third one. I got A Gathering of Shadows and A Conjuring of Light. And I liked these last two a lot better than the first one. The first one took me a minute to really connect with the characters and feel like they were important. But since I already had the base from the first one, the second and third were great because I already kind of cared. I already wanted them to succeed, and I liked that. I liked kind of the magic system because in a second and third book, you can expand upon that. And I haven't read a fantasy trilogy in quite a while. I have been kind of avoiding anything that has a sequel, honestly. And this was fun. I'm glad that I did this. It had relationships that I found believable, magic that I thought was cool, and something that I thought was really great about this series is it did have a low buy-in for a fantasy book. And by that, I mean, sometimes I pick up a fantasy book and right away it bombards me with too many terms and people and places where I have to concentrate to get involved in it. I can't just say, oh yeah, this is the plot, let's jump into it, I'll get involved, and then you can pull out some more details later. A lot of times it front loads a lot of the backstories, difficult names to pronounce, difficult things, and I lose my interest really quickly. These books did manage to keep it easy to jump into, which I appreciate. As a casual fantasy enjoyer, I really appreciated that. I think that starting out with, there are 4 Londons, Red London, white London, gray London, black London. That's easy. I can keep track of that. It's not something crazy. So low buy-in for me. I didn't have to go learn some new language to get involved in the book. And so I appreciated that. Now, this is the section, since I finished the trilogy, where I'm going to go over a couple spoilers. So if you would like to read this trilogy unspoiled, just skip to the next timestamp. I'm just going to say a few things that I felt about how things wrapped up. So, onto some spoilers. I did kind of hate it how every single side character that you were introduced to was murdered in the last book. I almost think they should have killed off some of the more main characters, because it kind of felt a little gratuitous to have, oh, well, they mentioned a sister once. The sister's dead. Oh, well, the guy who was a guard, he's dead. The guy, like, there were so many deaths of all the side characters, and it just drove me nuts. Like, maybe just have a main character die. If the mortality rate in this story is so high, I just think we needed a main character, a more main character to die. And so that kind of bothered me. Not that I wanted them to die, because I was rooting for them. I think the ending was very satisfying. If you want to feel like you rooted for these characters and they got what they needed in the end, you're gonna be so happy, right? It ended on such a satisfactory kind of note. But I think sometimes books, while I want them to do that, they shouldn't. And I think it might have been a little bit of a case of that. It was the ending I wanted, but not the ending I think I deserved here. If you're gonna kill so many people, I need to feel like maybe one of the main characters could actually die. That's all the spoilers for how I felt about the ending of this trilogy, but overall, I did enjoy it. I am surprised how much I enjoyed it, and I'm not sure if it is these books are that great, or if it's just been a while since I've sat down and binge read a fantasy trilogy, but I had fun. I guess I was just in the mood for escapism this week, and this worked well. And finally, a recommendation from Scott at Gunpowder Fiction and Plot. I picked up The Husbands by Holly Gramazio, and I liked the premise of this. We have Lauren, who comes home one day to find a mysterious man living in her flat. Of course, that is terrifying, but there is evidence that they're married, and they've been married for a long time, and this is her life. And she's very confused, obviously, when the husband goes up into the attic and another man comes out of the attic. And that man is her husband, and the world has shifted just slightly. And she can send her husbands up into the attic to be switched with another husband that she could have potentially married in a different life. And her life will be completely different. And she can see all of these possibilities. But she can't get any of the old possibilities to come back. She doesn't know how or why or anything about this. And she doesn't know how to choose which husband, when to decide that the husband that she has is the right one. Now, I enjoyed the premise because I think there is something very interesting about seeing where your life would have been had you made a few key decisions differently. And I think that's a really interesting concept in the looking at your life through different ways and to uncover how you know if you have taken the right path in life, or if you should have done something differently, where would you have ended up? And I thought that was really interesting. It did have a bit of that Groundhog Day-esque quality where it starts to feel kind of tedious at a certain point. She isn't repeating the same day over and over again. Time is still marching forward, but she just keeps sending husbands up and getting a new one over and over again, and her life keeps changing. And I think that the book focused a lot on, it was trying to focus on how do you decide who is right for you in your life? How do you make these big choices? And I can see where it was going. So it's interesting that she has all these husbands, because when she goes into the next life, she can still look up the past husbands she's had, and they're living their own lives, just she didn't choose to marry them. They are all real people. And I think one of my problems with the book is that when she saw really problematic things from certain of the husbands, she didn't go in the next life to try to fix it. She had hundreds and hundreds of husbands in this book, and you're telling me not one of those was a serial killer? Where was she leaving these police tip-offs in her next iteration of her life to make sure that justice was served? I think there were some implications for understanding people on a married level. When you know that many people, there is some illegal and dangerous behavior, and how much responsibility does she have over that moving into the future? I think that would have been interesting to explore a little more. But I think the big direction that I thought this book was going to go for, and it didn't, that I found disappointing, is what makes a marriage meaningful. It focused so much on how do you pick which of these guys to be with, that it didn't put together that marriage is about the journey you take together. And I think when she was dropped into these different lives where she didn't have a memory of their past together, I don't think any of those relationships were very meaningful. I think the only reason that marriage relationships are meaningful is the growth and the journey that you take together. And so picking whatever husband, but not having those experiences in becoming who she was in that version of her life is missing the point. I wanted her to end up with no husband and have to build from scratch, because that's what makes a marriage meaningful. And I think that the book never touched on what brings meaning to relationships. And I just think it scraped the surface of what could have been discussed using this plot device. And it was so frustrating for me. And maybe it's just coming from my own personal perspective. I am not an expert in marriage, but I have been married for more than 11 years. And I often look back at who I was 5-10 years ago and how much I've changed, but how much I've changed because I've been working and growing together with another person. And I think that is the essential part of a relationship, is who you become with each other. And I get that it touched on that in the book, like, oh, look at this different version of me, because every version of her was so different. Every husband showed up, she was so different. But if you haven't lived those experiences, even though it's different, it's not meaningful or important to you. I left the book feeling rather frustrated that that wasn't explored, when I thought that was maybe the core of where the book should have been. If she gets a husband that has an annoying habit of clicking his tongue all the time, and she immediately sends him back and gets another one, she doesn't understand that maybe that version had a journey where him clicking his tongue is something that she worked to get over, and she is a more patient person. And this is something that they've discussed together and they've worked and grown together. And I just feel like she was dismissing all of these potential husbands and not taking the time to really reflect on the person that you would have to grow to be the person that she ends up being in each of these iterations, and the work that goes into that, and the growth and the personal change that has to happen. So overall, this book was entertaining and the premise was fine, ended up getting a little tedious, and never made it to the point that I thought was important and should have been explored. And that is what I have read the past week. If you have any thoughts on these books, let me know in the comments down below. I have enjoyed this little foray into more fantasy, but I am excited to get back to some of my normal reading going forward. We'll see what comes up next. I just work my way through my TBR most of the time. So I will be back soon with another one, and I hope you are all having a wonderful holiday season.